here at KubeCon and Cloud Native Con, and today we have Ben. Ben, can you tell us a bit about yourself?
I spent too long at Google. I was there from 2003 to 2012, mostly working on distributed monitoring systems. So I worked on Dapper and wrote a paper about that, which is Google's distributed tracing system. And then I worked on Monarch, which is kind of like a Prometheus, Datadog, Wavefront kind of thing within Google. And then after leaving Google, I flitted around for a little while doing some failed social media experiments and then moved back to my comfort zone and am now building out a company called LightStep. We do root cause analysis, performance analysis, APM type of things for organizations adopting microservices.
And when was the company formed?
LightStep was started about 3 years ago in 2015, and we have been hard at work for the last couple of years and launched the company formally last fall, and we've been more public about what we're doing in the last 6 months or so.
And what are the problem that you're trying to solve that you created?
The problem that we're solving is pretty easy to describe. I think organizations are adopting microservices or serverless or whatever you want to call it, but what they're doing is they're building very complex software and they're splitting it into little pieces. And they're doing that for good organizational reasons and good computer science reasons, but it does result in a lot of confusion as they're trying to operate their systems. And so LightStep's solution is designed for those sorts of organizations to make it easier to get to the bottom of performance issues before they become like a brand problem, and also to make developers more efficient. So that's what we're focused on.
And what kind of organizations are these?
The publicly referenceable customers are places like Lyft and Twilio, Under Armour, GitHub. I don't know, there's a bunch of them, but they're mostly organizations that are operating complex software, and they're somewhere on the journey to microservices. I've actually, to be honest, I've never seen an organization that doesn't have a monolith. They all have that too, right? So everyone is trying to do some sort of sane, graduated migration to a world where there's a properly decentralized, decoupled engineering team and a properly decoupled, decentralized system architecture. And we start working with them usually when they have something like anywhere from a dozen services to 1,000 services. So.
And you dropped 2 or 3 keywords there. Whether you talk about microservices, serverless, or function as a service, are these 3 same things or are they different?
Well, that's a great question. I honestly don't like buzzwords very much, and I don't think of them as buzzwords as much as just shorthands. The thing that I actually care about, that I'm concerned with from a use cases standpoint, is really software complexity. That's the real driver of the problems that we're observing, is that people have very complex software, which means that it's difficult to tell coherent stories about that software, especially when it's not behaving properly. And that complexity is often manifesting in the form of microservices, serverless, functions as a service, whatever you want to call it. But the real driver is complexity, which is in turn driven by a need to differentiate companies through more powerful software. So there's a need for differentiation, which drives powerful software, which drives complexity, which drives a lot of complications when you're trying to operate software. So in terms of how I think about it from first principles, it's really the complexity that we're looking for. And so we almost always engage with customers who are doing something that's actually pretty difficult. And with that difficulty comes a lot of confusion if you don't have tooling that was built for that. And that's really what I think about. The microservices are more of a correlation, not causation.
That's a nice way of looking at it, because sometimes, and there's a deliberate reason to focus too much on the buzzword and not looking at why is this.
Yeah, I just actually had a conversation with a colleague of yours this morning at the New Stack, and we were discussing microservices, and I think it's really important, and I don't think enough people who are neck deep in this world, we need to do a better job than we've done about qualifying when microservices are appropriate and when they're not appropriate.
Right.
It's not a good thing for the microservices movement, if you want to call it that, to make it sound like it should be all things to all people, and that it's always appropriate, right? And recognizing the situations where it's called for, it's only going to help the microservices effort to make sure that it's not misapplied. And I don't think that our industry is doing a very good job of telling that story.
We have seen that with OpenStack, Docker. There's over enthusiasm, over hype, and then the honeymoon period is over, and then people start saying, "Oh, this is dead and that is dead."
Yeah.
But that is actually not the case. It's just things get stabilized, they become boring, so nobody talks about it anymore.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that is dead or something like
Yes.
that. So do you think that it will happen with Kubernetes also?
Well, honestly, I hope that that's how it happens. I hope that it just becomes something we take for granted. What I don't want to see is that people get jaded, and that's what I was getting at. Do I think Kubernetes will become boring? I hope it becomes boring. I really do. The thing that I think about a lot is, as long as application developers, people who are actually writing business logic, which is one of my favorite oxymorons of all time, but people who are actually writing the logic of application code, as long as they're also thinking about containers and Docker files, we're not done. The goal here is to not be thinking about Kubernetes, which doesn't mean you're not using it or that you might even have a positive feeling about it, but you're not thinking about it. We shouldn't be thinking about Kubernetes. We should be working a few layers of abstraction above Kubernetes in our day-to-day jobs as application developers. People at KubeCon, of course, can think about Kubernetes all day long, and that's totally fine. But I think we have this problem right now where the whole stack is so new that in order to participate in this ecosystem, even as an end user of these technologies, i.e. a developer or a DevOps person, you actually need to have a pretty deep understanding of the entire stack going all the way down. It would be like saying, hey, you're a Java programmer. Now tell me, let's talk about bytecode. What are the operators in JVM, class file bytecode? Tell me about all 10 of them or whatever. It's like, this is not a reasonable thing to assume someone will understand that level of depth, and that's kind of what we're asking people to do right now. So I think what I'd like to see, and what I actually think Kubernetes is doing a pretty beautiful job with right now, is making sure that the layers are clearly separated and that you carve out spaces for other projects to build literally on top using public stable APIs. What you don't want to see is Kubernetes as Kubernetes build the entire stack, because then you have this thing where if any one layer ends up being wrong, then the whole thing gets thrown out. And I think that's what often happens with these projects that have a really big ecosystem around them, is that too much goes into core. And I think they're doing a nice job carving out space for innovation above them, and even sort of in between pieces. They make it easy for monitoring vendors and security vendors and folks like that to plug into the system without having to modify it. So it really comes down to really principled software design and principled engineering. And if they do it right, I think we won't be talking about Kubernetes at the application layer anymore, which is kind of the vision, frankly. I think it should just work, and you'll be using something that's a lot simpler for most everyday tasks. That's what I'd like to see happen.
But we have seen that Linux, it's boring. Nobody talks about it, but everything runs on Linux.
Right.
And at the same time, it handles so many use cases that we cannot even, all the way from mainframe to NASA to IoT devices.
Yeah.
And they have somehow managed to do that. And
I think Linux is a great example of a success story in this regard.
I talk to Linus once in a while, and he would say it's not just about that I enable people to share the code. It's also about share the vision. People. I don't have any vision. If you ask me what Linux will be in 5 years, I cannot tell you, because people bring their vision.
Yeah.
And so I enable. They bring their idea. They bring their vision. And we don't have any vision. You can bring in there and you can do whatever you want to do. And you can go in so many different directions. There's no single direction that Linux has.
Yeah.
So that's actually a good use case and a good example also there to follow. It's already established and it's boring.
Yeah. Right.
But
I mean, I remember when I was a youth, tracking the minor versions of the Linux kernel and downloading them and building them myself. I mean, there was a time when it was similar, where I think hobbyists were tracking every commit. And now I think you're right. We take it for granted, but the brand of Linux is still pretty strong, and I think people acknowledge that it has a really important place in the ecosystem. And that's where I'd like to see a lot of this technology that's at this conference moving. I think that's the right place to go, as opposed to one of these projects where the hype cycle ends up being a house of cards and there's nothing there at the end.
What is the new use case that you are excited? I mean, there's so many, but what's the use case you are excited about?
I think I alluded to it a minute ago, but I do have a vision in my head anyway of ordinary, not very well trained developers who are able to build their microservices without even thinking very hard about it and having that just work. I mean, that's what I get really excited about, and some of the things that weren't even around 2 years ago that are now all over the talk track anyway at Cloud Native Con, things like service mesh and that sort of stuff makes me pretty excited. I get really excited when I see problems I know are really hard from a software engineering standpoint getting properly factored into some separate project, where it's like, load balancing, circuit breaking, peer-to-peer security, observability. These are hard things to get right, and it's really comforting to me to see people who I deeply respect building actually multiple competitive things. That's good too, right? It's like it's possible within this ecosystem for Envoy and Linkerd and Istio and Conduit, et cetera, the Nginx folks, all these things can be playing in the same space with slightly different approaches, and we can figure out which one does it best, which is great. And it might not be one, right? Maybe one's best for this person, one's best for that person. But we have all these people who are quite bright and experienced factoring that stuff out and solving those problems for people. I think that gets me pretty excited. And so the use cases to me it's really all just about getting back to writing application code and not thinking about any of this stuff. But you're starting to see people tackle, at first it was just, let's not talk about containers anymore, let's talk about services and things in the Kubernetes world. And now we're starting to talk a level above that. And I think we'll eventually get to a point where we're really getting pretty close to writing function signatures and not thinking too hard about the rest of it. And that's when it'll be comprehensible, I think, for people who don't have a lot of training and years of experience across the stack, and to make them productive in this world.
So, but why do you think that the people who don't have experience in the stack should be able to do that? Is it because there are not enough people? Or is it because it's not required?
From an economic standpoint, I would love to get to a point where, programming in a cloud-native environment is similar to writing formulas in Excel or something. If you think of Excel formulas as being the simplest form of computer programming, there are a lot of computer programmers out there right now who do that very comfortably. But honestly, a lot of the jobs that quote-unquote microservices do are pretty trivial things, where you basically take this data over here, you do some kind of transformation and maybe merge it with something else and then send it over there. I don't want to trivialize it or say it's easy, but from a conceptual standpoint, the jobs that a lot of these services do really are pretty easy, and yet we make them very difficult because the same person, before using something like Service Mesh, suddenly needed to learn about the time when they wrote this in production and the thing they were talking to wasn't very healthy, and they realized they didn't have like a sane backoff strategy, and they just retry looped and fried their system. That's a really easy mistake to make. And a developer shouldn't even have to think ahead about that being a possibility. They should just be using technology that says, well, if you want to send a message from A to B and B is down, the stack that you're using will take care of that and will do something sane. And that's where we need to get,
Okay.
So, and we're not there yet for what it's worth. It still requires a lot of knowledge to deploy these things properly. But I think it's a matter of months or short number of years before these things are much, much easier to operate and to develop on by default, right? So that's what I mean. So is it that we can't train people? Well, we could train people. I guess that's true. We could train everyone. But why? We could solve the problem so they don't need the training. That seems a lot better to me in terms of the total economic efficiency of the system. So that's where my mind has.
Right. Because I was talking to somebody and they were working on some technology and they wanted to know how to get involved. So how did you work on it? What is the process? If somebody is working on some cool technology but you want to build a community around it and you're like, hey, CNCF is a good organization. Let's just throw it in there. And how does it work?
Well, for me, so I guess the analogy for me would be around open tracing probably, which is a project that I started with some other folks at a variety of other companies. Open tracing was a project where we felt like there was a pretty profound need for something that just really briefly, open tracing solves one of the biggest problems with tracing adoption, which is getting instrumentation into your code. Tracing doesn't work unless you have instrumentation really deployed across your entire stack. But a lot of your stack is code you didn't even write yourself. So open tracing at this point comes with hundreds of projects that have open tracing instrumentation and makes that adoption a lot easier. So it really is a community project. It's something where we need to have a lot of constituents. It's supported now by, 10 plus different languages, and as I said, hundreds of packages, dozens of places you can send the data. It's really quite a diaspora of vendors and open source projects and companies that have bound themselves to this API. And that seemed like something where we would benefit from the expertise of the folks in the CNCF ecosystem. And it's a nice, coming here is probably the best chance I get to talk with a bunch of people who care about this type of thing. A lot of the partners in the ecosystem for a project like this are all here, So it's really just it's an accelerant for us in terms of all the conversations we want to be having as a project, and it's helpful as well just to make sure that we position the project with people who need to understand it, so they understand what problem we really solve, what problems we don't solve, that sort of thing. So CNCF just made sense to me, and I looked into it briefly and saw almost no downside, and so I was like, great, let's do this.
What benefit do you get, being part of, CNCF or being a member there, or what benefit do other members get from you?
Well, so I'm talking about open tracing. Open tracing doesn't spend any money on CNCF. Open tracing is a piece of IP that CNCF basically owns, right? LightStep, my company, joined CNCF years after we contributed open tracing to CNCF. LightStep's CNCF membership is just the usual thing where we want to have a booth and talk to customers, right? Okay. So, but that's really pretty separated from the open source contribution. And in my mind, I have a pretty clear separation between my open tracing activities and my LightStep activities. So LightStep joining CNCF, we did that for a variety of reasons, but those are mostly the normal kind of go-to-market commercial motivations. And open tracing doesn't have a financial relationship with CNCF, it's an IP relationship.
Right. Yeah, so you can very easily separate the code from the currency, right, or cash or whatever.
Yeah, totally. Business, and open tracing is a partnership with many of our biggest competitors. So open tracing, which is something that I also enjoy. For what it's worth, they're all great. I like them a lot. It's fun to come here and collaborate with them. And I think we're all interested in basically making the market larger for ourselves. And open tracing, the more that open tracing is successful, the easier it is for cloud native technologies to adopt in the enterprise, which is good for myself and for all of my competitors. And I think we're happy to work on that together, even if we have to fight over it in the end.
That's how open source work,
Yeah.
You benefit from the developer you don't pay salary to, right? Because that guy happened to work for your competitor. That's how
Yeah, I think it's a genuine kind of partnership at that level.
Developers work together and sales people fight in the market. That's how it works. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much too.
And we'll catch up with you in the next KubeCon or any other open source event that you go to.
Likewise.
Thank you.
Thank you.